Okay, thanks for having me. So this is joint work with Tarana Samoglu. And the question that I'm going to address today is, well, whether robots are coming for our jobs and whether automation will lead to the demise of labor, or on the other hand, automation is consistent with a process of balanced growth in which you can be automating certain jobs, but still the share of labor will remain constant and wages will keep growing at the same rate of the economy. So the starting point, I mean, there's a lot of fear or anxiety today perhaps about this question. So you see books, news articles, and so on, saying that the robots are coming. It's become almost a new literary genre. But when you look at history, it turns out that actually technology has always replaced some types of labor. So there's the canonical examples: weaving machines replaced artisans, containers and cranes also replaced dock workers. And recently, since the 1980s or 1990s, industrial robots in manufacturing plants have been performing the same jobs as blue-collar workers. And in fact, these concerns about automation or about robots taking over our jobs are not new. So when you read Ricardo was already worried about machines rendering the population redundant. Keynes was scared, or were not much scared, but he was fearing a period of transition of technological unemployment. But being Keynes, he was also happy that perhaps that would leave more time for us to focus on poetry and other stuff. And then Leontiev, drawing an analogy with what happened to horses, speculated that perhaps we humans were going to have the same fate and that we will run the way of horses and machines, where ultimately we're going to replace us in the workplace. So given this historical perspective, the real puzzle to me is why, given that technology has always replaced some types of labor, why is it that still we have so many jobs, and why is it that for the most part of history, this process of automation has coexisted with balanced growth, at least for the last 200 years? So that's the question that I want to address today. Now, our answer, or the answer that I want, the key point that I want to emphasize today is that we don't only have automation, but technology also means the creation of new tasks or jobs that perhaps didn't even existed before, and these tasks and jobs keep employment from contracting. So for instance, during the Second Industrial Revolution, when you had many of these machines replacing labor, you also have the creation of new occupations such as repairmen and financiers. During the last 30 years in the US, this figure shows that job growth, employment growth, has been stronger in new occupations, new job titles, things that didn't exist before, software engineers, things like that. So what I'm going to do today is actually put these two types of innovation together in a model in which we are not only going to have automation taking away some tasks from labor, but we're also going to have the creation of new tasks in which labor is going to have a comparative advantage. So we are going to have these two types of technology: one technology that benefits labor, and one technology that may hurt labor by taking away tasks away from it. So essentially what we're going to have is we're not going to fall into the lump of labor fallacy, thinking that there's only a given set of tasks that labor can perform, but we're going to endogenize that set of tasks. And we're going to have that set of tasks contract and expand endogenously. Now, the key thing that we're going to find in this model is that holding constant the range of tasks and increasing automation may actually hurt workers. So that's consistent perhaps with the fear and anxiety today. So when you don't create new tasks, but you automate existing tasks, that leaves fewer tasks for labor, and that's going to reduce employment, and under some conditions that could also reduce wages, and that's always going to reduce the labor share. So perhaps that can explain some historical or current periods in which actually automation has been running ahead of the creation of new tasks, and that could explain declines in the labor share and so on. But interestingly, these periods can be counteracted by the creation of new tasks, which is going to have the opposite effects on labor markets. So once you automate much, that starts putting pressure on wages, and that creates incentives for firms to actually introduce tasks that are labor intensive. So that's the main mechanism that we're going to emphasize today. And what that creates is a powerful stabilizing force, which in the long run leads to balanced growth. Nonetheless, there's still room for concern. This doesn't mean that labor is not going to be rendered redundant or that there are no challenges. There are, of course, challenges, and I'm going to emphasize some of these challenges at the end. For instance, when capital is very cheap, so let's imagine a situation where the discount rate is super low and actually households are willing to take very low returns on capital, you could have a situation in which endogenously the economy converges to an AK model in which firms only use capital. So there's this type of equilibrium as well. That's what we call a horse equilibrium. There's also the concern about inequality. For example, these new tasks may favor some types of workers, or these new tasks and jobs may be created in very different cities from the cities that house the old tasks. So for example, you may automate production in Detroit, but these new software tasks are only created in San Francisco or New York, so this has important implications for workers in the affected areas. And also there are concerns about welfare. So if unemployment is not involuntary, then automation is always going to increase welfare, because essentially it allows us to consume more by working less, right? And that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. But on the other hand, if there's a chunk of unemployment that is involuntary and people really want to work more than they're working, then automation could be bad in terms of welfare because it's displacing workers. So it has a first order effect on workers. So that's the last concern that I'm going to emphasize today. So the plan for the talk is essentially I'm going to introduce our framework. So it's going to be a task-based framework. You're going to have several tasks. And capital is going to be competing against labor in the production of each of these tasks. So that's the defining characteristic of our labor. And I'm going to introduce this framework in a static way. Then I'm going to go to a dynamic extension of this model in which I'm going to endogenize the behavior of capital. And I'm going to talk about balanced growth and growth in general. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how to endogenize technology, because we want to have a model in which automation is responding to factor prices and to endogenous incentives to automate and the creation of new tasks as well. And I'm going to end with some of the concerns that we... You promised some empirics. Sorry? Yes, and there's a fifth point, which is a promise that I just made to Philippe, that I'm going to show some empirics, showing that essentially some robots may be creating some harmful impact on workers in some areas in the US, which is one of the things that we're emphasizing here. Okay? So this is the static model. So the idea in the static model is that we're going to have a unique final good Y, and this final good is produced combining several tasks. So what are tasks? Things such as welding, painting, all of the things that go into the production of a car, let's say. And these tasks are combined with an elasticity of substitution sigma. So the tasks always are going to range from n-1 to n. So n here is going to be a measure of new tasks. So as I increase n, I'm shifting the set of tasks that we are actually using to produce towards newer, more complex tasks. So that's going to be one margin of technology. And this range is normalized to 1. That simplifies the algebra. It also allows us to get exact balanced growth. I'll get into the details at the end. So like I said, we're going to have a quality improvement structure. We have the range of tasks moving, the level of tasks moving, but the range of tasks remains constant. So we're going to have better and better tasks coming in. So automation is going to come here. How do we produce a task? Germán.
What is that? So why don't you have this, why don't you expand?
So you could have expansion, and I think David is going to work with a model in which you have expansion and you could get different consequences when you do that. You won't get exact balanced growth here in our model. So here is just to get exact balanced growth. But you can think about it also as an anomotheticity, like some of these old tasks that we already automated, we are not really using it that much. So we automated agriculture, but now agriculture is a small share of economy. I think that's sort of what we're trying to capture. The movement of the economy towards more complex processes that have not been automated yet. So the production of a task, this is how we produce tasks. We are going to use an intermediate QI, and that intermediate is there only because we're going to use it to endogenize technology in a couple of slides. And you're going to combine that intermediate with capital or labor. So that's the second term that is in blue there. So for tasks that are above a threshold big I, those tasks are tasks that are not yet automated. So you can only produce them with labor, and that's why you only get to choose labor for those tasks. Those are the tasks in the first row. In the second row, however, those are the tasks with little I below big I. Those are tasks that are already technologically automated. And for those tasks, actually, you get to choose whether you produce them with capital or with labor. And essentially, what firms are going to do is just compare the cost. So if it's cheaper to produce with labor, they'll produce those tasks with labor. If it's cheaper to produce those tasks with capital, they'll produce it with capital. And that threshold I is going to measure the availability of technologies that can replace labor in those tasks. So the possibilities for automation.
What's Q again?
Q are intermediates that we're going to use to endogenize technology. So at the end, when we move to an endogenous technology model, firms are going to have incentives to introduce these intermediates that embody their technologies. No, it's a quantity. Quantity, yeah. So, for the purpose of the presentation, I'm going to actually assume that the share of those intermediates that Gianmario was asking about is very low, and that's just because those intermediates introduce an anomoteticity in the model, so they make the model hard to work with. So we're going to assume that the share is low, or that they enter into the production function in a Cobb-Douglas way. That's just only going to ensure that we have homothetic representation of the production function, and that's going to simplify our life. So actually, we're going just going to make two conceptual assumptions. The first conceptual assumption is that this gamma I, that's the term that was in front of labor, that's the productivity of labor in a given task, that gamma I is an increasing function. What this means is that labor has a comparative advantage in these new, more complex tasks. So when you create a new type of job, initially labor has a comparative advantage in that task. That's what this assumption is saying. So creating new tasks benefits labor. It doesn't benefit capital that much. That's the idea of that assumption. And therefore, we are going to have two types of technology, an increase in N, which is going to benefit labor, and an increase in I, which is automation, which is going to benefit capital. And we're going to study how these two types of technology play against each other. And finally, another expositional assumption, like I was saying before, essentially firms are going to choose the cheaper factor to produce if they are allowed to choose between the two factors. But today I'm going to focus on the case in which automation is binding. So that if it's technologically possible to automate a task, you're going to produce it with capital. That's essentially assuming that wages are high enough or that capital is cheap enough so that you're going to be in this region, right?
Is it obvious that gamma I should be strict?
It is not obvious. I mean, at some level, it's an assumption that doesn't have any generality because you can always sort tasks, but it has bind when we actually assume that the new tasks that you are creating are the ones in which gamma I is larger, right? And for that, I think that the best justification we have is sort of this figure, which shows that indeed employment has been growing faster in these new jobs or these new tasks, suggesting that they're less prone to automation. But you can think of our paper out. Let's try to think what happens if this is the state of the world. That's going to be something that gives us balanced growth and allows us to understand the historical data as well if you don't buy the assumption.
It looks like for all the robots, it looks like an old economy thing. Right?
Sorry, can you repeat?
For all the robots in the title, it looks like an old economy thing. Like we're worried about artificial intelligence.
Correct.
So
Correct. No, I get your point. So maybe new technologies are just having a comparative advantage in new tasks, like artificial intelligence, right? So this is more about classical automation, perhaps. Perhaps this is not a good model of artificial intelligence. Okay, so this is how the model is going to look. You have this task from n-1 to n, and at the end of the day, what you can have is these two types of technology. You automate tasks, and when you automate tasks, you are squeezing labor, right? So that's why automation is going to be bad. I mean, not bad in a welfare sense, but bad in an opportunities for employment sense for labor. On the other hand, the creation of new tasks is going to take away those tasks in the bottom. Those are the obsolete tasks that I was discussing with Gianmario, and create those new tasks at the other end. So that benefits labor, because since labor has a comparative advantage there, you get more tasks for labor to produce. Now, the final thing that I have to describe in the model is the supply of factors. So we also want to understand what's the impact of automation for employment, not just for wages or factor prices. So we're going to take a model of endogenous labor supply. We're going to assume these balanced growth preferences that come from King plus Rebello. And essentially, these balanced growth preferences, what they do is that households are more willing to provide labor when the wage grows more than consumption. So consumption here determines the value of leisure. So if wages are growing faster than consumption, households are going to supply more labor. And if wages are growing below consumption, then households are going to supply less labor, right? But here in our benchmark model, unemployment is going to be totally voluntary. So we don't have any friction in the labor market. It's just a leisure consumption trade-off. And the wage is going to be denoted by W and the rental rate of capital by R, okay? So the first proposition is that actually you can take that microstructure that I just showed of several tasks combined to a CES aggregator and you can aggregate it up. So it turns out that the first proposition is that in equilibrium you can represent output as a CES function of capital and labor. The elasticity of substitution is that sigma, which is an average between the elasticity of substitution across tasks and between the intermediate good and the factor. And interestingly, in that production function, the share parameters, that is the thing that is coming with the K and with the L, that depends on technology. So here we have a representation of technology of the aggregate production function in terms of capital and labor, in which technology endogenously determines the shares. So for instance, you can take a Cobb-Douglas representation and think of automation as a reduction in the share of labor and the creation of new tasks and increase in the share of labor. Sorry. Okay. Factor prices, this is a competitive economy, so factor prices are given by the marginal productivity of labor, wages by the marginal productivity of labor, and the rental rate of capital by the marginal productivity of capital. And as I was saying before, the optimal employment decision is just given by these trade-offs. So essentially, you supply more labor when the wage is large relative to production or consumption. So let me tell you what are the impacts of technology in this simple framework. So essentially, you can take that production function that I just showed you and compute what's the relative demand for factors. And this takes a very well-known form because it's a CES. So essentially, you get that it depends on the relative wage to rental ratio depends on the relative capital to labor, but also on that term on the share parameters. So what you get here is that automation is always going to be biased against labor because it squeezes labor into fewer tasks. Automation is always going to reduce the wage to rental rate ratio. And therefore, automation is always going to reduce the labor share in this particular model. New tasks, on the other hand, are going to have the opposite effects, right? They're going to increase the wage to rental rate ratio, and therefore they're going to increase the labor share. And you can immediately see that, therefore, in this model, the way we're going to get balanced growth is because these two types of technologies have opposite effects on the labor share. So if they move in parallel, you can have a situation in which the labor share remains constant. And because, finally, because automation lowers the wage to rental ratio, it means that automation increases consumption more than it increases wages. And therefore, automation is going to reduce employment in this model as well. It's going to be an efficient reduction of employment, but I'll get, when I get to the welfare considerations, of more general models in which that reduction in employment could be inefficient. Now, that was just showing the impact of automation and new technologies on the distribution of income. What happens actually to output and to factor prices? Well, because automation allows firms to replace expensive workers by cheap capital, automation actually increases output. And you can see the formula there. So that formula is showing the impact of automation and the creation of new tasks on output, holding constant the quantity of factors. So that's the impact of automation and new tasks on productivity. And you can see that automation increases output more so when the wage is high. So when wages are high relative to the cost of production with capital, automation is very beneficial in terms of output. And same for new tasks. So when wages are low, in that case, new tasks are very beneficial in terms of output. So the instances in which one technology is good for output and the other is less good for output depend on how the wage compares to the rental rate in this particular model. Now, what's going to happen to factor prices? I just showed that these two technologies increase output, so one might be tempted to conclude that therefore they also increase factor prices, right? But that's not always the case, because remember that automation always also reduces the labor share, so you're going to have two competing effects. On the other hand, you get these productivity gains that tend to increase wages, But on the other hand, you get the displacement effect. You get fewer tasks for labor, a reduction in the labor share, and that effect may actually offset the productivity gains. So this is interesting because this is a model in which one type of technology that is increasing output may actually reduce the marginal product of labor, may actually reduce wages, right? So not all types of technology are always going to increase wages, as this example showed. So that's the point I just made. Okay, so let's turn to the dynamic economy. So that was a simple static economy just to introduce the framework, but there the stock of capital was fixed, households were not saving, and technology was not moving over time, but we want to understand sort of the long-run patterns here. So, because we want to get exact balanced growth, I'm going to assume that that gamma I has that exponential form. That's just going to ensure that we get constant growth over the growth path. And I'm going to take an exogenous path of technology. So I'm going to get that n and I increasing over time, and I'm going to call little n the difference between these two numbers. So the interesting thing is that I can represent the aggregate production function in this case as follows. Remember that CES production function that I showed you before. Here it is using the little n notation. So the interesting thing is that you have a CES, the net impact of automation and the creation of new tasks is actually to augment labor. You can see that labor appears there in the right with a term that is increasing in I. Why? Because you are keeping the range of tasks that labor can do constant, but you are making them more complex. So labor has higher productivity in these tasks over time. So their net effect is to augment labor. And the little n is going to regulate the distribution of income between capital and labor. So you get a theory in which essentially when little n is constant, you get Osawa's theorem. Everything is labor augmenting and you get balanced growth, but you could also get episodes in which the little n moves and you can get changes in the distribution of incomes over time. So that's like essentially what the next proposition shows. That is that you can have balanced growth. Balanced growth is again a situation in which factor shares are constant, and for balanced growth to be possible, you need to have a representation of technology in which everything is labor augmenting, which is what I just showed you. And what the proposition says is that you can have balanced growth only when the little n, the difference between automation and the creation of new tasks, is constant. So you need the two technologies to be advancing at the same rate. So that's maybe an explanation for why in the last 150 years we have had balanced growth. Maybe that's because we have had both types of technology going on at the same rate, but it also leaves open the possibility that during some periods one technology may advance faster than the other, and it's exactly during those periods where you can have a decline in the labor share or changes in the distribution of income. So let me actually do some transitional dynamics here. Let's imagine what's going to happen when you have a period of increasing automation. So let's imagine that at time t, the IT technology, the automation technology, shifts up. So you got something like, I don't know, maybe machine learning or artificial intelligence is not the best example, but you get like robotics in manufacturing coming in or something like that. So the impact that this is going to have is immediately, this is going to affect wages. It could increase wages when the productivity effect dominates, but it could also reduce wages if the displacement effect dominates, and that's the top left panel. What's going to happen to the interest rate? The interest rate is going to increase, right? The rental rate on capital is going to increase. Why? Because automation is increasing the demand for capital, which you can use now to produce more tasks. So the increase in the rental rate is going to trigger some capital accumulation in response, so that the rental rate goes back to its steady state level. Remember that in a steady state or in a BGP, the level of the interest rate is always pinned down by the household preferences, so capital adjusts to keep the price of the rental rate constant. And the implication, the interesting implication, is that actually wages always increase in the long run. Why? The productivity gains must go either to capital or to labor, right? Those are the only two factors of technology. And if the price of capital is fixed, well, wages must increase in the long run. So automation could create a period in which you get stagnant wages, but eventually as capital accumulation kicks in, you'll get that positive effect on wages. What's going to happen to the labor share? Well, the labor share is going to decrease, as I showed before. Capital accumulation may actually benefit the labor share a little bit if capital and labor are complements. It may even create worse effects if they're substitutes. That's not the case I'm showing there. But interesting, you could have very similar effects if what happens is not an increase in automation, but a deceleration in the rate at which we're creating new tasks. So there's a big concern today that perhaps what's happening to many developed economies is that we just are running out of ideas, or that it's becoming harder to find new ideas, and perhaps it's just becoming harder to create new tasks, new complex tasks in which humans have a comparative advantage. So if that's the case, then this is how the transition is going to look. We're going to have a decline in wages, decline in the labor share, decline in capital, under some conditions a decline in the interest rate, and growth is also going to slow down. So perhaps what we are seeing today is a combination of this slowdown in the rate at which we introduce new tasks and an acceleration of the rate at which we introduce in which we automate tasks. That could explain very well the macro facts today. Now, last point. I just showed you that balanced growth is possible when the two types of technology advance at the same rate. But that sort of just raises a more fundamental question. Why would both types of technology advance at the same rate, right? And to answer that question, what we need to understand are what are the incentives for firms to introduce these two types of technologies. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to endogenize the direction of technological change, and that's why I needed the intermediates that were there in that production function. So the way we're going to do it is that we're going to assume that there's a constant supply of scientists, and these scientists are creating ideas. They are either allocated to automating tasks, so creating new robots or developing better machine learning algorithms and so on, or these scientists are allocated to create new products or new tasks in which human labor has a comparative advantage. And technology is going to evolve endogenously depending on the allocation of the scientists. So if I allocate SI scientists, that's going to increase the I. If I allocate SN scientists, that's going to increase the N. And the productivity of scientists are those kappas. We're going to assume in this benchmark model that there's no creative destruction of rents. So when you automate a task, you have to compensate the owner of the intermediate that used to own that task. And when you create a new task, you have to compensate the previous guy. This is just because creative destruction introduced many multiplicities here, and we want to state with what's the role of technology, not of this creative destruction of rents. And
what do you mean by compensate?
So essentially, if I automate a task, I have to pay you the profits that you were getting. It's going to be clear in one slide what I mean. So what this means is that the value of automation is not only the profits that you get from selling your intermediate, but the difference between the profits and the profits the previous guy was making by selling the intermediate that didn't work with capital. So the incentives to automate are going to depend on the difference between the interest rate and the wage that you would have to pay to produce that task. And that sort of makes sense, and that's also how a planner would allocate scientists, based on that cost difference. So if wages are high, it means that there are many incentives for automation, because it becomes profitable to replace the expensive workers for machinery. The creation of new tasks works in the opposite way. So when wages are low, you have more incentives to introduce new tasks in which labor has a comparative advantage, precisely because labor is the cheap factor. Now, the interesting thing here is that automation and new tasks are responding to factor prices. So there's not so much a market size effect here. It's just market factor prices that guide the direction of automation. And therefore, what the condition that is going to ensure balanced growth asymptotically is that the value of these two technologies must be equal. When the value of these two technologies are equal, you're going to have the two types of technologies advancing at the same rates. So the final proposition is that essentially you can have balanced growth in this type of model. Essentially, you're going to have a very strong form of self-correcting dynamics. The more you automate, the further you reduce the wages in the next task to be automated, and that's going to create incentives to automate less and introduce more tasks. That's essentially the self-correcting force here. So if I start automating, let's say, blue-collar jobs, the next jobs that I have to automate, white-collar jobs, are harder to automate or less profitable to automate, and therefore that creates this self-correcting force. At that point, you're better off allocating scientists to creating new tasks to exploit the cheap labor, right? But there's also an important source of instability in this model, and it has to do with those productivity gains that always increases wages in the long run, as I told you before. So imagine that you automate a lot, but you are in a situation in which actually automation increases wages. So in this case, you could have that automation could reduce the incentives to introduce new tasks. Why? Because automation is increasing the wage. So you could have many situations. You can have a unique interior BGP, balanced growth path, that is going to be locally stable because of this self-stabilizing force. You could have multiple BGPs because of this self-destabilizing force. Or you could have a situation in which actually you get no automation at all. So these are interesting and these are good news for labor because it's telling us that no matter how endogenous incentives for automation play out, you're going always to be in one of these cases in which labor doesn't become redundant. You always get incentives to introduce new tasks at some point. So let me go to the room for concern and perhaps the empirics, if I have time. So the first room for concern is that, as I was saying, so far in this model, looks that the goods are not bad for labor. Essentially, you could have that automation may reduce the labor share, but it's not going to lead to a process where labor becomes redundant because you always have these new tasks and these incentives for these new tasks. In terms of welfare, however, the picture may be quite different. So let's imagine that labor is supplied just trading off leisure and consumption, as in the model I just showed you. In that case, automation is always going to increase welfare. Why? Because even if automation reduces employment, people were already indifferent between working and not working, so those are second-order effects, and they don't have any cost. But more interestingly, let's imagine that there are labor market frictions, and that actually people would like to work, but they cannot find a work because unemployment is frictional. In that case, automation may reduce welfare. Why? Because automation reduces employment, and that has a first-order effect on households. So I think that when we are thinking about the welfare implications of automation, it's very important to understand whether displaced workers are worse off or not. In this model, they were just indifferent. In more general models, they are not indifferent, and that's going to be an important point that I think needs to be understood better. The second concern is inequality. I was showing that the main force that generates stability in this model is the creation of new tasks. But those new tasks are complex tasks in which probably high-skilled workers have a comparative advantage. So initially, the creation of these new tasks is only going to benefit the more skilled. So you could have that during transitions. Even if you are creating these new tasks that on average benefit labor, they're going to benefit high-skilled workers more, and it's going to take a while for low-skilled workers to adjust or to learn these new tasks. So that's another concern, that the transitions may be plagued by a very large increase on inequality. And let me finish with some of that. So in part motivated by these concerns, we started looking empirically at what's the impact of automation on labor markets. So this is something that I'm not going to be able to talk a lot about, but essentially what we wanted to understand is that if consistent with this model, automation could reduce employment and wages, and what we are doing is this type of empirical exercise. So this is a map of the US, and what we were doing is taking industries in the US and looking at which industries have been the ones that have been adopting more industrial robots. So these are manufacturing industries, and industrial robots are reprogrammable arms that can be reprogrammed to produce a bunch of tasks in the manufacturing industry without human supervision. And this is how the projection of those industries in the US look. So you will see you have a red line in the Midwest, there in the Rust Belt, because there's a lot of car manufacturing production in the Rust Belt, and car manufacturing is one of the industries with the largest concentration of industrial robots. You have also some in Texas, where there's some pharmaceutical industry that has been also using a lot of these robots. You also have car manufacturing in California and so on. And what we looked was what happened to these local labor markets as robots became cheaper and as firms started adopting more and more of these robots. And what we found was that employment declined in these labor markets and wages decline in these labor markets. Now, how does that square with what I just told you? It's just telling us that this transition period may be taking a while, right? So essentially, we're making the case that new tasks eventually are going to be introduced, but there are many problems. Probably those new tasks are introduced in other labor markets completely different from the ones that got affected in the first place. So you need to move people, and moving people is costly because people do not want to move that much, right? Or perhaps the transition takes a while. So you can get very long periods. This is here study focuses on a period of 17 years almost. And for that period of 17 years, that those forces, those stabilizing forces, do not seem to be kicking in for those labor markets. So it shows that really in the short run, automation could have a cost for workers, but we need to understand better the implications in the long run, and that's sort of what the model does. The model is a more conceptual point about what's going to happen in the future with this labor market. The model is optimistic about the future of those labor markets. I think that the final word is the evidence, right?